Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is our first substantive meeting in the sense that there's stuff that you had available to read beforehand, some actual Frege in it. I urge you to go to the website relatively often. I try and update it. You'll see for this time I put excerpted passages from the two things that we read. That's a good way to know sort of what I'm going to focus on, what I think is important in the readings. Let me mention at the outset, no class next week. I have to give a lecture in Zurich. But a reading assignment, I'm suggesting you read the Grundlagen. So it says that on the website, but if you look at the next week, 2 weeks from now when we meet, you'll see also I've extracted what I find the most important passages from the Grundlagen. That's a good place to start, but please do read the whole thing. So Frege's Begriffsschrift of 1879, published when he's 31, is the founding document of modern logic, that is to say specifically mathematical logic. And one of the things I want to think about today is why that's so. What's different about logic after the Begriffsschrift than before? There's a lot of things I'm not going to talk about. In particular, the discussion of the concavity and generality. I'm going to be real quick on that this time. We'll worry about it later in the course when we see some of the later developments of it. But in general, I'm leaving you in the competent hands of Danielle Macbeth in her Frege's Logic book. If you read the chapters I suggested there, you'll get a good overview of things. Last time I talked about Kant, Frege, and Wittgenstein as indispensable philosophers. And by that I meant that their works are so deep, widely resonant, and conceptually transformative that serious philosophers have to be at least sufficiently familiar with their contributions to be able to use them as landmarks in their own navigation and development. So in talking about what's transformative and revolutionary in Frege's contribution, I want to get a running start on it. I need to start a little bit farther back. What we'll see is that Frege is doing something quite different than what we were all introduced to under the heading of logic. Logic comes out of it, but that's not his principal interest. That is what we would recognize as logical undertakings. He's doing what, to use Peirce's word, I'd call semantics in the beginning. And logic shows up as an aspect of a larger semantic project. And that's a good thing because I think the semantic project is what gives particular philosophical interest to the technical parts of the logic. So when I was talking about Kant last time in connection with Frege's force-content distinction, I told a story about why Kant needed an entirely new theory of judging, of the act of endorsing a claim. That was because he appreciated that the traditional notion of predication or of classification that he inherited from the logical tradition, certainly already in the Port Royal logic, but this is Orthodox Leibniz as well, was asking that notion of predication or classification to do two different jobs that turn out to collide with each other. And the one was to show how you could build up some conceptual contents out of others. And the other job was that people thought of what you were doing in making a claim as representing a relation between concepts, representing a relation of predication or classification. And by thinking about cases where sentences and the judgeable contents that they express occur as embedded components of larger units, for instance, and paradigmatically as antecedents of conditionals, hypothetical judgments, Kant says, and Frege follows him in that. Conditional is a 20th century phrase here we've come to use. And concept, well, so we can use that notion of classification to understand contents, but we need some other view about what we're doing in judging. And here his revolutionary new idea is, well, what you're doing in judging is binding yourself by norms, by concepts in the form of rules, which you become normatively subject to only by applying them. This feeds into his picture of the distinction between normative compulsion, the spooky, important one that matters for discursiveness, and mere causal or exercises of force. He says, what's distinctive of normative constraint is that you can only apply it to yourself. Nobody else can normatively constrain you. That's the autonomy idea. And we see it in a particularly clear way, though that's normally discussed on the side of his practical philosophy. We see it very clearly in the theory of judgment. It's when I say that the coin in my pocket is copper, I've played that counter in a game and made myself subject to a certain kind of normative assessment of what I've said as correct or incorrect, not according to what I think copper is, but according to the game, the counter in the public game, copper, that I've applied. By applying that, I've bound myself by the rules of copper usage. So for instance, whether I know it or not, in calling the coin copper, I've committed myself to the claim that it will melt at 1084 degrees C. Metallurgists can say that, but I can bind myself by norms that reach beyond my own appreciation of them. So Kant turns things on their head, says the important thing to understand is the grip that concepts have on us, not our understanding of them, the grip that we have on them. So this is a revolutionary move. Frege, like Wittgenstein, is downstream from that. Force for him is a normative concept. That's why logic in the end is a normative science. But put that to one side now. What about the part of content that's left? So Kant is making a force-content distinction, and he even sees what distinguishes the ed side of what's always called the notorious ing-ed ambiguity between what's judged and the judging of it. Kant even saw what distinguishes the discursive case of the ing-ed ambiguity from non-discursive cases. We can distinguish my throwing from the ball that's thrown, my jumping from the ditch that's jumped. But the content, my claiming and what's claimed, that's a content in a distinctive sense. It's what Frege will call conceptual content, Begriffsschrift, Inhalt. And what's special about it is the way it compounds, the way conceptual contents can contribute to the conceptual contents of larger things. Kant, in appealing to the role of judgeable contents in hypothetical judgments as the antecedent, already saw that it was the way we can embed those contents in other contents that distinguished the discursive case. Kant also made a revolutionary move, a bold and brilliant move in his understanding of content. he saw as the tradition, at least since Descartes had seen, it was almost a ritual among the early modern philosophers to make fun of syllogistic logic as not getting us anywhere, as just taking out with one hand what you've put in with another hand. In Kant's particular case, he, studying the proof structure of Euclid's elements, sees that Euclid's mathematical arguments can't be made in syllogistic form. He'd worked hard on syllogistic, published a paper that said we only need one syllogistic form. Let me show you how to reduce the other three principal forms to the major form. But he also saw that that wouldn't do, that in particular there were parts of Euclid's arguments where he makes existential claims. Between any 2 points there's a midpoint of them, and claims about infinity. If between any 2 points there's a point between them, there's an infinite number of points between them. Those things, he said, we can't reason about syllogistically, which for him, he followed the tradition in saying we can't think about them conceptually. Concepts are what are articulated in the syllogistic. There has to be another cognitive function that is not a conceptual function, but thinking about the role of constructions in Euclid. He said it's a constructive activity. You take the 2 points and construct a point between them. You take the 2 points, construct the line of the infinite points between them. He thought of this as a faculty of imagination, or any way that is called on in imagination. It was synthesis, he said. I talked about an insight about what's going on here that we only had very recently, but that I think makes it intelligible. This was the Hintika-Friedman realization that all and only the cases Kant called on synthesis for are cases that would be expressed in contemporary quantificational form by a for all followed by a there is. For all pairs of points, there is a midpoint between them. And that alternating quantifier, that was what syllogistic couldn't get near to. Thinking of the Euclid case, he says, well, that's a case where we have to invoke a new cognitive ability. This isn't the way he put it, but looking back from the Hintika-Friedman thing, we can say it was something like a practical ability for some concepts that if you're given some things that fall under one of them, for all these things, you have the practical ability to find something that falls under another one, whatever goes with there is. You have a practical ability, if given a pair of points, to construct, well, to find the point that's between them. Now, this was a brilliant idea. It was vastly influential for the next 100 years, thinking about synthesis as what you needed to add to conceptual content in order to get reasons in the sense even in which we see them in Euclid. It was almost entirely wrong. And we can see that it's wrong because, and we can see why Kant could have been misled. He was misled because he was starting with Euclid. And in Euclid, the cases where you need these abilities are things you can think of as constructing something in imagination. But when we realize that what's really at issue is these alternating quantifiers for all there is, we see, well, you need to understand that distinction in order to understand why the inference from why anyone who is a self-admirer is an admirer of someone, but it's not the case that everyone who's an admirer of someone is a self-admirer. In order to understand that, you need to understand how these alternating quantifiers work. And that has essentially nothing to do with constructing anything in imagination. It's a distinctive kind of intellectual endeavor, all right. But the model that Kant used for that extra cognitive faculty of synthesis, that model is, though sensible in the context of the Euclidean examples that suggested it to him, he was, in Wittgenstein's phrase, nourished on too poor a diet of examples, didn't realize how extensive the jobs that synthesis would be called on to do inferentially were. If he were, he would have seen that this model wouldn't help. And that this difficulty has ramifications throughout Kant's corpus, mathematical and dynamic concepts. There are all sorts of things that come with this. But Kant was right to see that something more was needed than you were getting in syllogistic. So he has conceptual content and synthetic abilities, I want to say, in Kant. Now, Frege is going to come along and say, if you think of the conceptual abilities not in a syllogistic way, but in the way I recommend, then you can do everything you wanted to do with synthesis in purely conceptual terms. Remember and I mentioned last time that the Hintige-Friedman idea was the sort of a link that, at least for me, had the scales fall from my eyes to sort of understand what synthesis was, is saying, well, don't think about alternating quantifiers, think about the formally equivalent version of that uses Skolem functions, where a Skolem function corresponding to for every f there is a g, is a function which, given any f as an argument, gives you a g as a value. And that's the model, really, for Kant's additional capacity. And as I say, I think of it, I think it's a charitable reading to him, but it suggests the generalization he needed. It's an ability to, when given things that fall under F, to find something to represent something that falls under G. If you've got that, capacities like that, now you can build everything up, though nobody could see that until we had Skolem functions, quantifiers, and so on. But now we can ask, how did Kant think about conceptual content? I said, well, it's what you articulate with syllogism. Well, he thought of it in an essentially traditional way. That is, content for Kant, conceptual content, has two dimensions. There's what's contained in the concept and what falls under it. So what's contained in it is a kind of intention with an S. What falls under it is essentially the Boolean extension of it. So, we see in Boole the development of the extensional part of traditional conceptual content in a way that makes it much more powerful for understanding seriously multi-premise inferences. But the intentional part, what's contained in a concept, well, the slogan that Kant inherits is, those are the characteristic marks of the concept. So characteristic marks of being gold is it's a mineral, it's malleable, and it's yellow. Say those are things. Copper has as its characteristic marks, it's a mineral, it's malleable, and it's red or orange. So we can think about what they have in common. Being mineral is something that is contained in both of them. Being malleable is contained in both of them, but the colors, being yellow or red, those are not contained in them. So the more that's contained in a concept, the less that falls under it. There's an inverse relation between these. There are more things that are minerals than there are that are gold, because the mark of being a mineral is contained in the mark of being gold. Frege is interested in explaining a certain kind of conceptual content, a certain kind of relation between conceptual contents, and that interest leads him to need a completely new way of thinking about conceptual content, not in terms of characteristic marks and extensions. He needs to start over in thinking about conceptual content in the same way that Kant needed to start over in thinking about the act of judging. There were examples that just were never going to be intelligible on the old models. And in Frege's case, and I think this is an example that both makes the point intelligible and it has reverberations through the actual constructions that Frege offers us. He wants to understand the relation between two relations now, an example of which is the parent of relation, and the other of which is the ancestor of relation. So for A to be an ancestor of B is for there to be a string of parent of parent of parent that connects them. What he wanted to define is the notion of the ancestral of an operation, of a relation. So you have a relation like parent of, and its ancestral is ancestor of. The one he cares about on down the line, you have a relation of successor of, one is the successor of 0, and now we want the ancestral of that, which is going to be the concept of a natural number, right? One that is either the successor of 0 or the successor of its successor or whatever. Now, if you think about defining that, we need a quantification over sort of how many times you're applying the concept. There is some number of parent of relations such that stringing them together will get you from A to B. That's something that is absolutely necessary for understanding the concept of a natural number. Very beginning of mathematics, right? We're just getting at the numbers, but you have to understand the notion of an ancestral and the notion of, and maybe you saw this phrase in the Begriffsschrift, being hereditary in a sequence. That is, if any element of this sequence has the property, then everything downstream from it has the property. That's the kind of property that being a natural number is. And Frege saw early on that there was no prospect whatsoever in understanding the relation between two relations like this in terms of characteristic marks and so on. Indeed, that notion of characteristic marks didn't handle relational predicates well at all. That's what led Leibniz to say, well, there aren't really any relations. There are just corresponding properties. There isn't really a relation of being a parent and a child. There's the relation of being parent of and being child of, but those are properties. So just as thinking about hypothetical judgments showed Kant that he needed to start over in thinking about what the activity of judging is, so thinking about what to Frege seemed obviously a conceptual relation between a relation like parent, a a concept like parent of, and a relation like ancestor of. That's clearly a conceptual relation between them, and yet this talk about what falls under it, what is contained in it, doesn't help us at all. And just as Kant's revolution begins with this new idea that he had, that what you're doing in judging is taking up a normative stance towards it, committing yourself, making yourself responsible. So Frege's idea is that the conceptual, above all, has to do with inference, with consequences. And so in section 3 of the Begriffsschrift, he says the contents of two judgments can differ in two ways. Either the conclusions or consequences, Schluss is the word he uses. Sometimes he'll use Folgerung, following, that can be drawn from one when combined with certain others, also always follow from the second when combined with the same judgments, or else this is not the case. And he considers an active sentence in its passive. At Plataea, the Greeks defeated the Persians, and at Plataea, the Persians were defeated by the Greeks. He says same things follow from those two claims, no matter what else you combine them with. The inferential significance of them isn't any different. Even if a slight difference in sense can be discerned, he says the agreement predominates. In the preface, he calls the differences that aren't differences of, that don't make a difference to consequences, he calls that coloring, Farbung. He says, we've got the real content, and then we've got the coloring of it, and I don't care about the coloring. So he says, I call that part of the content that's the same in both, the conceptual content, begrifflich Inhalt. Only this has significance for the Begriffsschrift, for the concept writing, the writing of concepts that we have. And this characterization of conceptual content was picked up by Frege's student Carnap, who in the logical syntax of language, his real breakout work, defines the content of a sentence as the class of non-valid sentences that are its consequences, in the sense that they can be inferred from it. Let me mention in passing, sort of out of school, a thing among mathematicians is calculating your Erdős number. Erdős co-authored papers with many people. If you co-authored a paper with Erdős, your Erdős number is 1, his number is 0. If you co-authored a paper with someone who co-authored a paper with him, it's 2, and so on. Mine is 5, by the way. But you can calculate your Frege number. We have to use teacher of, he didn't co-author any things. And Carnap, for 3 years, was a student in 10, in 12, and in 13, was a student of Frege's. Indeed, we have his handwritten notes from some of the seminars that he took, and he was a compulsive note taker. You can find these, they're in the Archive for Scientific Philosophy, where we have the Carnap papers, and he wrote down things like, in the middle of his notes when Frege's at the board, Heiterkeit am Zentrum. The students were giggling in the middle of the room while Frege was doing this. They weren't paying any attention at all, but Carnap noted down that this was going, so presumably so he could think about it later on. Anyway, Carnap was a teacher in Berlin in the 20s of Peter Hempel, who was on the faculty here many years, who was my teacher at Princeton and then colleague here many years. So Frege to Carnap is 1, Carnap to Hempel is 2, Hempel to me is 3, your Frege number is 4. Usually we do this going from Carnap to Quine and through other things, but this is a particularly short route. Anyway, Carnap just basically takes this over in his definition. Frege says about this notion of conceptual content that it's at the center of his enterprise. This is what he means by Begriff, by concept, and that's what this is a Schrift of, is Begriffe. But I mentioned last time that Frege writes like a mathematician. He says things only once, and he doesn't do a lot of motivation or even sort of commenting on it. We'll see why this was a good idea. So I want to unpack what's in this definition. So the first thing is he starts with consequence relations. And he appreciates that if you're going to think about what follows from a given sentence, there's a question about, well, sort of what follows from it all on its own. That's sort of interesting. But it has more content than you see just from that, because sometimes you can combine it with other things, and things follow from it that didn't follow from either the other things or from it. We're worried about multi-premise inferences. So when he's thinking about consequence here, he's thinking about a whole premise set that consists of sort of the sentence we care about and a bunch of collateral premises or auxiliary hypotheses that we're considering all of those together and what follows from that. Is everything that follows from it, when combined with certain others, also follows from the other one. So it's not that there's a single sentence that is the consequence of this premise set. The premise set has multiple consequences, and that's what we're going to be correlating with the occurrence of this sentence in the premise set. Parenthetically, for those of you familiar with where this all goes, it seems like he's thinking about consequence sets Tarski-wise, not Gensen-wise. That is, that he's thinking about them conjunctively, not disjunctively. And I say that because in the Gensen case, I'm thinking of the sequent calculus in particular, when we have a multi-succedent sequent, gamma, turnstile, delta, it means that at least one of the elements of delta follows. It's, as it were, the disjunction of all of those. And we look at all the sets delta as the consequences. And Frege seems to be thinking of it the way Tarski does in his classic concept of logical consequence from the early 30s, where you have a premise set and a conclusion set, each element of which is a consequence of the premise set. Frege doesn't explicitly address this issue. It only came up later, and these are not, I mean, they're incompatible ways of doing things, but you can go back and forth to a large extent between them. So he's identifying specifically conceptual content in order to keep the coloring out of the way, with whatever makes a difference to the goodness of inferences. Now we might ask, what kind of consequences or inferences are these? Well, one thing we can be sure of is it's not restricted to logical consequences, because we haven't introduced any logic yet at all. We're going to do that on the basis of these consequence relations. It seems that he's talking about things that follow in some pre-systematic sense of follow. He has his eye on mathematics, but we know he has more in mind. Sorry. Oh no, that is here. Yeah. So he says in the preface to the Begriffsschrift, and I think I put this on the handout, I'm convinced that my Begriffsschrift can be successfully applied wherever a special value has to be placed on the validity of proof. It seems to me even easier, as in the case of laying the foundations of differential and integral calculus, when he's going to define, in effect, continuity at the end of the Begriffsschrift. It seems to me to be even easier to extend the domain of this formula language, Begriffsschrift, to geometry. Only a few more symbols would have to be added for the intuitive relations that occur here. Point, line, between. In this way, one would obtain a kind of analysis situs. The transition to the pure theory of motion, and hence to mechanics and physics, might follow here. In the latter fields, where besides conceptual necessity, natural necessity prevails, a further development of the symbolism with the advancement of knowledge is easiest to foresee. So he doesn't restrict his ambitions to logic and logical consequence. He wants the notion of what follows from classical mechanics to be something that can confer conceptual content that he wants to represent. Why does he only look downstream? If the insight is conceptual content is just whatever makes a difference to the goodness of inferences, what he says is, well, look at the role that a sentence has as a premise, together with whatever auxiliary premises there are, what follows from it. But doesn't it matter what its role as a conclusion is too? What does it follow from? Now, if you have the set of all the consequences, if we think of them as here's some premise set, here's the auxiliary hypotheses, gamma, here's A, the sentence whose content we care about. I'll just use that symbol for follows from. Typically, use that one instead of that. If you don't want to commit yourself to all sorts of stuff about the structure of the relation. So anybody who's doing non-monotonic logic will use the snake turnstile instead of the regular turnstile. Okay, so we look at the consequences that follow from A, and we're going to say that A and B have the same conceptual content if, whenever the one implication is good, the other one is. So now think about what he's defined here. He wants to think about conceptual content as something like inferential role. If we had all of the the true turnstile statements like that, all the good implications, that determines both the good implications in which A appears as a premise and the good implications in which A appears as a conclusion. But you have to be thinking about all of them for that. When he says sameness of conceptual content, he doesn't say, well, and they must be implied by all the same sentences as well. Now, in his system, you'll be able to prove that if the same things follow from them, then they follow from the same things. But he doesn't say anything about that. Dummett, Michael Dummett, the Oxford philosopher, who in a telling of this story that I linked to on the website, old piece of mine called Semantic Inferentialism and Logical Expressivism, I pitch that in terms of the three sages of inferentialism: the sage of Jena, Frege; the sage of Oxford, Dummett; and the sage of Pittsburgh, who is Sellers, who is the modern inferentialist. Dummett's contribution was to say, look, any expression or sentence has two aspects to its meaning. There's the circumstances of appropriate application. What does it follow from? Or more generally, when is it appropriate to utter it? But the inferential will be a key part of the circumstances of application, even of a term like red. That is, it'll matter that it follows from scarlet and that it implies colored, even if there's more to its content than that. But Dummett says there's also the consequences of appropriate application, what follows from it. And often when we're puzzled philosophically by concepts, it's because we don't see how those two hang together. This is the way Dummett would analyze concepts, what's problematic about concepts like personal identity. He says, well, we know sort of what the consequences of this is the same person as that, or the person who did this is the same person as the person who did that. Sort of forensic consequences holding criminally liable turns on that, for instance. We sort of agree what follows from being the same person as, but disagree wildly about what it follows from, what the circumstances of application. Is it memory continuity or bodily continuity? Is it social role? Exactly what are the circumstances that go with that consequence? And Dummett points out that if you only understand one or the other, there's crucial things you don't understand about the concept. If you think about the concept in military law of being AWOL, away without official leave, well, you could understand perfectly well that that had the consequence that you were liable to be thrown in the brig. But if you don't know what the circumstances are that make you liable to those consequences, then you don't understand the concept. If you have learned, say, from the game of Wolfenproof, how to sort logically complex sentences into the ones that are tautologies and the ones that aren't, you have the circumstances of application of the concept of a tautology. You've mastered those, but if you don't know what follows from them, that those sentences are true under all interpretations of their components, then you don't understand the concept of a tautology. So Dummett criticizes various theories of meaning as one-sided because they focus either just on the consequences or just on the circumstances of application. Now, I'm not going to pursue this issue with Frege, but Frege assumes, and it is true of his logic, that if two sentences play the same premissory role, then they play the same conclusory role. If you're interested in reasoning at large, outside of logic, that's just not true in general. And one of the results that Ulf Lobel and I are proud of in our recent book is showing that under very general circumstances, including non-monotonic, non-transitive cases where the circumstances and consequences of application come apart, the premissory and conclusory roles come apart. The logic of premissory roles is K3, the strong Kleene tri-valued logic, and the logic of conclusory roles is LP, Graham Priest's logic of paradox, which are known to be duals of each other, but we show that they're what you get if you just follow premissory roles or just follow conclusory roles in the case where they come apart. Okay, so that's all just a gesture at an assumption that I think Frege did not follow out and say, okay, and I did this on purpose. This was good enough for his purposes. But he's taking a metaphor, the role that a sentence plays in inference or implication or consequence, the role, the function that it performs. This is not his notion of function, this is a functionalist notion of function. The contribution that the occurrence of a sentence in the premise set makes to the goodness of implications. All right, there's no role, function, contribution. These are suggestive metaphors, but he cashes them out here. He says, I'm telling you that two things play the same one of those, just in case, well, this holds. That is, if there's a good implication that has A as a premise, and you substitute B, it preserves the goodness of the implication, and vice versa. If that's true, if you can always substitute the one sentence for the other as a premise, preserving the goodness of the implication, that is, we could say, if they're intersubstitutable salva consequentiae, saving the consequences of them, then they have the same conceptual role, they're playing the same role, they're doing the same job, they're making the same contribution here. And I want to emphasize that the form of this is something I would say Frege invented, except there's a footnote about Bolzano because he invented it too, but nobody knew. But our interest in Bolzano will be because of this. And this is a phrase that Hans Sluge used in his Frege book. He attributes to Frege the method of noting invariance under substitution. So we've got some property, in this case it's the goodness of an implication, and we look at which substitutions preserve that. And we gather those together. In this case, he's getting all the sentences that are intersubstitutable with each other, intersubstitutable in the sense that substituting one for another as a premise will never turn a good implication into a bad one. Now this salva consequentiae talk is downstream from Quine's talk about intersubstitution salva veritate, that preserves the truth value of things. Now, Frege is also the grandparent of that talk, but we see here he's using intersubstitutability of sentences in implications salva consequentiae, saving the goodness of the implication. That's how he cashes out that metaphor of the contribution it makes, the role that it plays, or whatever. And what I want to come around to by the end of this session is to see him doing that again. We have this notion of conceptual content that is defined only for things that can be premises of inference. Right? But we would like to assign conceptual content to what's expressed by singular terms and predicates as well, but they can't be premises of implications. They can't have the same conceptual content in this sense because they don't play the role of premise in any implications. What can we do? Well, we can still note invariances under substitution. Now invariance of what? Well, invariance of the conceptual content of the sentence it occurs in. If there's two, let's say, singular terms, such that substituting one for another never changes the conceptual content of any sentence that's involved in it, this thing is P of A, and this one is P of B, if you can substitute this for this and vice versa, and never change the conceptual content of the sentence they're occurring in, that is, never change a good implication into a bad one, then we can say that these things that can't themselves be premises or conclusions of implications play indirect inferential roles, and so conceptual contents. So Frege is going to turn the crank twice on this substitutional machinery. He's going to use the method of noting invariance under substitution twice. Once to go from a feature of implications, is it a good implication or not, to assimilating sentences accordingly as they have the same conceptual content, and then again assimilating subsentential expressions insofar as substituting one of those for another one doesn't change the notion of the conceptual content of the sentences that they're involved in. This was wholly new. Nobody had done anything like this before. It is recognizably a version of a mathematical semantic project. We're used to thinking of semantics on the model of Tarskian model theory and its successors in possible worlds and truth maker semantics and so on. But in the Tarskian one, we start by assigning interpretations to singular terms and predicates as extensions within a domain, and build up from that the set of models that validate a certain sentence, and on the basis of that, inclusion relations among the models that validate a certain sentence, then we can define consequence relations. But the striking thing is that's a bottom-up account that starts, as the tradition, the pre-Kantian tradition had, starts with singular terms and predicates, what they think of as particular and general concepts, builds up a semantic representation of sentences from that as sets of models, and then builds up, defines, computes a consequence relation from that by looking at inclusion relations. If all the models that validate A also validate B, then A implies B. We're building up. That's not how Frege is doing it. Frege is going from the top down. He's starting with the notion of implication or inference, taking that for granted, some notion of material. You have to start with a division of these implications into the good ones and the bad ones. And then he's going to understand the content of sentences in terms of the contribution they make to the goodness of inferences in this very specific sense of the contribution, this substitutional sense. The ones that are intersubstitutable, saving the goodness of the implication, have the same sentential content, I try to avoid using the word propositional content for this because that has other implications. It's not Frege's language, but it's the content that's distinctive of sentences. And then, though we haven't gotten there yet, we're only in section 3 of the Begriffsschrift, but what he's going to do is analyze or dissect those sentences based on the expressions that occur in them by turning the crank one more time on this machinery of noting invariants under substitution. And the top-down order of explanation is going to work because we start with, as an invariant, the goodness of an implication, and we assimilate sentences. But now we've got those assimilated sentences, and now we can take those assimilations, the conceptual content of the sentence, we can take that as the invariant and use that to assimilate singular terms to singular terms accordingly, as substituting one for the other never changes the begrifflich Inhalt of sentences in which they occur. So this is really quite different from what we see sort of downstream in the logic of the next 150 years. Let me stop there for a moment for comments or questions about this. Yes?
So in functional semantics, by giving an interpretation, we can very easily and intuitively capture the idea of reference. So this term refers to this particular object in the domain. But it's hard to say how we can say this intuitive connection between values and word in the Frege top-down semantics. Maybe we can give some story for the initial stage when we're talking about the good implication and inference. There is a certain connection between word and good inference, but do you have can you give some suggestive idea how can we capture the reference in this case?
Well, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? Is how is he going to get, objects in there if we understand concepts in this sort of way? How are we going to get connected to the world? And in fact, we'll see he has, once he introduces singular terms in section 9 of it, he has another model, another semantic model, the name-bearer model, what Sellers derisively calls the Fido model. He's thinking of that's the name. The Fido, it's the relation of the name to its bearer. And in the Begriffsschrift, he just basically assumes that these coincide, that the notion of conceptual role that he defines functionally by the method of noting invariants under substitution with both turns of the crank, he just assumes that if two names have the same bearer, then substituting one for the other will never change the goodness of any inference in which those sentences appear as premises. That's an extensionalist assumption, and as we know from the last 150 years, you can get a lot of mileage out of that. Indeed, you can build back something intentional with an S out of that if you want to. But that's not where Frege starts. Where he starts is with this notion of conceptual content as inferential role. He is, I want to say, a semantic inferentialist. And thereon hangs a tale. I'll be brief about it here because I've belabored it elsewhere. But in starting there, Frege is picking up a rich tradition. Enlightenment epistemology was always the home to two more or less uneasily coexisting traditions, two conceptions of the conceptual, the intelligible, or the graspable. I mean, the fundamental concept, meta-conceptual concept of the period initiated by Descartes was representation. He introduced that as the more abstract notion, succeeding the prior notion of resemblance as what modeled what we now see as the representings and the representeds. But there always was a minority semantic tradition. Most prominent examples are Spinoza and Leibniz, who took reason and reasoning rather than representation as the key notion. They accepted that representation was important in thinking about human cognitive activity, but they weren't willing to accept Descartes' strategy of treating the representational character of our ideas as simply a brute fact. The idea that our thoughts are, as Descartes said, tanquam rem, as if of things. I mean, some of them really are of things, but some of them are only as if of things. But he just took that to be a brute ontological fact. For Descartes, the world was divided into the things that are by nature representings, that are tanquam rem, and those things that by nature can only be represented. And Spinoza and Leibniz each wanted to understand those representational relations in terms of prior notions of what was a good reason for what. Their idea was that the way in which ideas could reach beyond themselves, make themselves liable to assessment as to their correctness in virtue of how it is with something, was to be understood in terms of how we reason with them. So I actually think this division of the pre-Kantian early moderns into representationalists like Hume or Locke and inferentialists, I actually think that cuts deeper than the distinction nearly coextensional of them into empiricists and rationalists. It's semantic rather than epistemological. I think it's more important. Kant has many inferentialist strands in his thought. Frege starts off that way, well in section 3 anyway. One other thing I want to point out here is I mentioned last time that one of our topics, one of the things that he really gets clearer about than anybody ever had before in the second half of the Grundlagen is the notion of abstraction, where by abstraction you introduce some new concepts, abstract concepts, on the basis of some old ones that are more concrete relative to that abstraction. I mentioned the example that he uses, introducing the concept of the direction of a line by saying that two lines have the same direction in case they're parallel. So we start with the concrete things, the lines, and a relation among them. They're parallel, and on that basis, he says, we turn that relation, it's an equivalence relation, it's reflexive, symmetric, and transitive, we start treating it as an identity of a new kind of thing, directions. Well, do you see that that's exactly the form of the definition of conceptual content that he gives us? We start with a relation between, let's say, sentences and single sentences. It's a relation we can define an equivalence relation on sentences being intersubstitutable salvo consequentiae. It's reflexive because substituting A for A never turns a good, as a premise, never turns a good implication into a bad one. It's symmetric if substituting A for B doesn't make it a bad inference, then substituting B for A doesn't. Well, on down the line we might worry about that, and it's transitive. If you can substitute B for A salvo consequentiae and C for B salvo consequentiae, then you can substitute C for A. And he's saying, just as if the lines are parallel, we say the lines have the same direction, that's a move to abstraction, to a new kind of concept, a new kind of object. That's exactly what he's doing here. He's saying we have this equivalence relation among sentences being intersubstitutable as premises, salvo consequentiae, and if so, we're going to say that any two that stand in that relation have the same, and now we introduce this new abstract notion, just as we introduced directions, they have the same conceptual content. He's going to worry about the ontological status of these objects and when are moves like this licit? When do they actually give you semantic content with things that really exist? And the point I want to make now is this doesn't just come up for numbers for him. This comes up with everything semantic. It comes up for conceptual contents which are introduced here by abstraction. The method of noting invariance under substitution assimilates sentences, but he doesn't just do that. He says if they're assimilated in that way, then they have the same conceptual content. You can think about the Grundlagen as his thinking hard about the status of that sort of definition. And if there's some problem with abstraction as a way of introducing new concepts and new objects, conceptual contents are things. We refer to them with singular terms. If there's a problem with that, then there's a problem with doing semantics this way. More thoughts or questions? Okay, what's the relation of logic to this? Section 3 in the founding document of modern mathematical logic. What is the relation of logic to conceptual contents? And his answer is an expressive relation. It's the job of logic to make explicit those conceptual contents. And here, so he said, in my Begriffsschrift, this is still in 3, the only thing that's relevant in a judgment is that which influences its possible consequences. This influences, look, that's a causal notion, this is a metaphor here, but he's told us what he means substitutionally. By influences, I mean any substitutions that can turn a good implication into a bad one. That's what influencing it is. Only this has significance for the Begriffsschrift. Right? In my formula language, the only thing that's relevant in a judgment is that which influences its possible consequences. Everything that's necessary for, this is translated valid inference, I object to that translation. Valid makes us think of validity in one of the many senses, proof theoretic, model theoretic, that we have. He just says richtig, right, correct. A correct Schluss, and Schluss means inference, implication. It's also the word that's used in ordinary German for syllogism. Those are the vier Formen, the Schlüsse, because syllogisms were supposed to be the consequences. He's got that long in his rear view mirror, but everything that's necessary for a good inference is fully expressed, but what's not necessary is mostly not even indicated. But nothing is left to guesswork. Now, this next quote is from the long Boole essay. I'm looking at the quotes on the handout here. In contrast, we may now set out the aim of my Begriffsschrift. Right from the start, I had in mind the expression of a content. Conceptual content, only conceptual content, the rest is irrelevant coloring. We're doing this in black and white. What I'm striving after is a lingua characterica, in the first instance for mathematics, not a calculus restricted to pure logic. Now we know he says in the first instance here because he wants a lingua characterica for mechanics, for physics, geometry, and so on. But the content is to be rendered more exactly than is done by verbal language. Complaining about Boole, he says, this is the next quote, the reason for this inability to form concepts in a scientific manner, that is, for instance, to be able to explain what the relation between a relation and its ancestral is, lies in one of the two components for which every highly developed language must consist. That is, we may distinguish the formal part, which in verbal language comprises endings, prefixes, suffixes, and auxiliary words, from the material part proper. The signs of arithmetic correspond to the latter. What we still lack is the logical cement that will bind these building stones firmly together. The task that he sets for logic is to express conceptual contents perspicuously. The idea of a lingua characterica is a Leibnizian notion. That's a set of concepts or a language that cuts at the conceptual joints, that lets you express the content of every concept exactly and perspicuously. And Leibniz further had the idea that if you had that, if you had a lingua characterica that could express the internal content, Leibniz is still using that thought, of sentences, that you could build on top of it what he called a calculus ratiocinator, a rational calculus, which when Leibniz says the question of whether an implication is good or not comes up, we would express it in the lingua characterica, apply the calculus ratiocinator to it, and as he says, let us calculate. It would just let us calculate whether that was a good implication. Frege doesn't say that he's building that calculus on top of the lingua characterica, but he does. So how's that supposed to work? Still, we have this expressive job of logic. Frege is very serious about that. The job of logic is not to prove anything. There are proofs in it, but the job of logic is to say something. It's to say what the conceptual contents of various concepts are. For instance, to say what the conceptual content of the concept ancestral of a relation is, so that we could then argue that or define natural number, being a natural number, as a property that's ancestral, that's hereditary in the ancestral of the successor relation. I mean, that's basically how he's going to do it. But still, okay, that's what logic's supposed to do. How is that supposed to work? Well, the first bit of logical vocabulary that he introduces is the conditional. And he says in the Boole essay, the precisely defined hypothetical relation between contents of possible judgment has a similar significance for the foundation of my Begriffsschrift to what the identity of extensions has for Boolean logic. Now, in Boolean logic, it's not just the identity of extensions, it's really the inclusion relations among extensions. But it's thinking about those unions, intersections, and complementation of extensions that give Boole his operations that correspond to addition, union, multiplication, intersection, complementation as taking the negation, and then we look at identities among these things. That's the way it works for him. And Frege is saying, not for me. What the beginning of logic is the conditional. If A, then B. Why? Because a sentence like that in the language, I'm using that for the conditional, says that A implies B, or something like that. The idea is that the expressive function characteristic of the conditional is to make implication relations explicit. What do we mean by explicit? We mean as the conceptual content of something that can be a premise of inferences. Right? The challenge is to introduce conditionals in such a way that A arrow B is a consequence of gamma, just in case if that's true, then we can see this sentence as saying anything that implies that is such that if you add the antecedent to the premise set, the conclusion, the consequent is a conclusion, follows from it. This is called the Ramsey test, but it's just the deduction theorem and detachment together give you this. The claim is that that relation constitutes codifying the goodness of a whole set of implications by looking at the inferential role. Well, here it's the inferential role of this as a conclusion, as a premise we want. For its premissory role, we want to be able to detach from it. If you've got the antecedent and you've got the conditional, then the consequence is the consequent. That's the Ramsey test. In the same way, we can say something about negation as sort of flipping validities. Those are the only two official connectives that Frege introduces, the conditional negation, where the strength of Boolean logic is with conjunction and disjunction, corresponding to intersection and union. From Frege's point of view, those are merely aggregative connectives. They're not expressive connectives. Negation expresses incompatibility. He doesn't go on about this in the way he does about the conditional. The conditional codifies implications, and conjunction and disjunction are just Boolean helper monkeys. They aggregate the premises and conclusions in various ways that turn out to be helpful, but Frege doesn't even introduce those connectives as defined connectives. He says which combinations of conditionals and negation give you the effect of and or, but those are not really logical connectives for him, because there's nothing about implications that they codify. Now, I think there's a picture here of what it is to be a conditional. Its job is to make explicit the goodness of implications. And here, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that implications can be good in various different senses. And there's going to be conditionals that correspond to those different senses. The horseshoe, the two-valued conditional, the so-called material conditional, but very bad name for it. We all know the sort of paradoxical character of that horseshoe, but it is a good feature of an implication if it doesn't have true premises and a false conclusion. At least if it did have true premises and a false conclusion, that's a bad feature of the implication. So a sort of minimal goodness property of implications is it ain't one of those. And that's what Frege starts with. The third case, he says, where you affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent, that's ruled out. That you don't do. That codifies at least that minimal good dimension of assessment of the goodness of an implication that doesn't have true premises and a false conclusion. That's very weak, of course. Remarkable how far you can get just with that. But for something stronger, suppose it were impossible that the premises be true and the conclusion be false. That's a much better implication than one that just doesn't happen to have true premises and a false conclusion. Well, that's C.I. Lewis's hook of strict implication, is the conditional that's true just in case it's impossible that its antecedent be, that all of its antecedent conjunctively be true and its conclusion false. And that's another feature of goodness of inference that one might want the expressive power to codify in one's language, to make explicit in one's language. Another good-making property, another way in which an implication can be good, another dimension of normative appraisal of the goodness or badness of an implication, is it would be a good thing about an implication if there were a recipe for turning any argument for the antecedent into an argument for the conclusion, turning any reason that you had for the premises into a reason for the conclusion. If you ramp that reason or argument for up to the level of proof, if there's a systematic way of turning a proof of the antecedent into a proof of the conclusion, that's the intuitionistic conditional. On this way of thinking, there isn't the right conditional, the question to ask about classical, two-valued, and intuitionistic conditional is not which one really captures if-then. The question to ask about them is what good-making feature of inferences do they express? That's what you've got to understand the relation between the classical horseshoe, the intuitionistic conditional, the hook of strict implication. Let 100 flowers blossom. As long as you can say when you introduce your bit of vocabulary what it means, what is it codifying. For it to be a conditional, there has to be something about the goodness of inference that it's codifying. If you divide inferences into those that are pleasing to God to make the transition and those that are not, according to your sacred book, see how you can introduce a conditional that lets you say that this transition is pleasing to God. And how do implications that are good in that, how do they combine with each other? What inferential roles do they play? So these Ramsey principles, the deduction principle, detachment, and so on, these are giving pieces of the conceptual content of conditionals in terms of features of implications. And that's what Frege's vision for what logic was supposed to do is. He thinks there's a crucial dimension of the content of our claims, its conceptual content, the part that matters for reasoning, for what good moves you can make from it, and let's say to it. And the job of logic is to let you talk about those transitions, let you say things about them. If your notation is sufficiently perspicuous, then if you just lay out the conceptual content of the premises and the conceptual content of the conclusions, you should be able to tell by inspection whether the one follows from the other. That's a criterion of adequacy of your representation of the conceptual contents of these logically compound claims being perspicuous, is that you can tell that. So, I mean, it's remarkable that Frege then actually came up with something that does this, and that's where modern logic comes from, inter alia. But I hope you're beginning to appreciate the philosophical achievement that's on display already in the very earliest moves of the Begriffsschrift here, is a complete rethinking of what conceptual content is, and in particular, a rethinking of what logic's job is. Again, not to prove something. The proofs are just to lay out the inferential role of logically complex sentences and to show that they have conceptual contents, non-defective conceptual contents. The proofs are crucial for articulating those conceptual contents of logically complex sentences. But things could be fine from that regard and not play the expressive role that's so important to him of making explicit conceptual contents, that is, the roles they play in inference, in this non-metaphorical, or anyway cashed out metaphor of role or contribution that he's got. This is where logic began. It's supposed to play this semantically expressive role, to make semantic contents, well, the conceptual contents, explicit, that is, sayable, thinkable, judgeable. That's the sense of explicitness here. And Frege essentially succeeds at that. Do you think modern quantificational logic succeeds at that? It's gotten off and doing something else, really. That Fregean version is not what has driven the development of logic over the last 150 years, because it spun off this shiny technical result, modern quantificational logic with identity, and that was important, but it wasn't as important as what he set out to do and the way he set out to do it. So, I mean, I'm making a case here for the philosophical significance of what Frege's project is, the one that led him to invent inter alia modern logic. It's because he cared about what philosophers have always cared about, reasoning, us as rational creatures, and he sees logic as playing this absolutely crucial philosophical role in articulating and making explicit conceptual contents. Any of them. This vision was, in fact, animating people downstream from Principia Mathematica in the dawn of analytic philosophy. They didn't think Frege was doing that, but they thought, well, we have these powerful new logical methods of reasoning. Couldn't we do empiricism again with the same bricks in the wall, Leibniz self-intimating experiential episodes, but where they just had glue-like resemblance and contiguity and so on. We've got all the inferential relations we can make explicit with modern logic. They thought of doing that. That was, in a way, true to Frege's vision, but his inferentialist version of it was potentially much more powerful than that. Okay, I propose that we take our break now, 15 minutes, come back at 2:47.